Okay. So welcome again, everyone, to this series of webinars. My name is Emily Mathiasen. I am working with the International Secretariat of FIAN International. We're an international human rights NGO working on the right to food and nutrition based in Heidelberg, Germany. We're also the Secretariat of the Global Network for the Right to Food and Nutrition, which is the network hosting this series of webinars. Just to say a little bit about the network, the Global Network is an international network of civil society organizations, social movements, and indigenous peoples that have been around since 2013. The network organizes different advocacy work and co-construction of knowledge, including publications, reports, fact-finding missions, and webinars. So this is part of this initiative. In terms of the series, one of the speakers will explain a bit more about that, but just wanted to give you some information about the network. And so I will turn it over to our first speaker, who is Sabine. Just give me 1 second. Okay, Sabine, everyone should be able to hear you and see you now.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you. And very warm welcome to you all. I'm Sabine Gooden. I'm the coordinator of what's called the Independent Food Aid Network, which is a quite new organisation, 3 years old now, based in the UK that represents frontline grassroots organisations responding to growing levels of food insecurity here. And we represent them with government and so on, but we also connect and support these organisations as a network. And we're very pleased to be working with FIAN International and WhyHunger on behalf of the Global Network on the right to Food and Nutrition on this series of webinars. Now is a critical moment for the right to food. Food insecurity levels are growing desperately in North America and in Europe. Here in the UK, we've just had a report of over 1.5 million emergency food parcels being given out by what's called the Trust or Trust Network alone. And the response in the immediate is, of course, charitable food aid. But the long-term solution, of course, isn't charitable food aid, and we need to be focusing on addressing the root causes as much as we possibly can. And the right to food, the right to adequate food and nutrition is a way to cement the changes that we'd like to see happen. The first webinar will be looking at the right to food in the context of this growing charitable food aid response in both North America and Europe. And I'd be very pleased to now introduce the other speakers, please, Emily. Firstly, we'll hear from Professor Graham Ritchies, who is the author of Food Bank Nations and is based at the University of British Columbia. And also then we'll go on to hear from Alison Cohen, who is Senior Director of Programmes at WhyHunger. And then lastly, we'll hear from Imogen Richmond Bishop, who is the coordinator of the Right to Food programme based at Sustain and also works with Just Fair. So without further ado, we should now turn to Professor Graham Ritchies, who will be speaking to us from Vancouver Island.
Hello.
Thank you, Graham.
Well, hello, thank you very much for the introduction, Sabine. I've been working on this whole food bank issue since the mid-1980s and writing about it. And what I've done is prepared a short slide presentation, which I think is shortly going to be uploaded, so that I will talk to you about these issues. Okay, so there it is. Just hold on a moment while I just move it over here a bit. So the title of this webinar today is Undermining the Right to Food, the Rise of Food Charity in the Industrialized North. I've given the two themes that I would like to talk about. One is the social construction of hunger as a matter for charity and why the right to food matters. So that's specifically what I'll be talking about. And I've got an initial quote here, which from a very well-known French historian, geographer actually, and social historian called FIAN Brodel, which I came across in 1985 when I was writing my first book about food banks and the welfare crisis back in Canada. And what he said was, and I came across in the World Press Review, was today's society, unlike yesterday's, is capable of feeding its poor. To do otherwise is an error of government. So that's, if you remember anything from what I say, that's my sort of mantra, if you like, in terms of how I think, what the role of government should be. So going to have the next slide, please. Okay, so what I thought I would do is I've got a couple of slides which really talks about the rise of food charity in the industrialized North, and I'm looking at this specifically in the context of the development and growth of food banks. And this slide here actually indicates their national origins, their institutionalization, and global spread. Now, if you look in the top sort of left-hand corner, we've got North America. We've got the first food bank being set up in 1967 in Catholic St. Mary's Church in Phoenix. And if you look down actually to the bottom right corner, you'll see actually the Global Food Bank Network and the Food Bank Leadership Institutes. Both of these organizations are based in the US. But the European Federation of Food Banks also cooperates with them. And the point I'm really making here is if you look from 1967 to 2007, it's taken 40 years going from a small food bank in a Catholic church in Phoenix, Arizona, to two global institutes which are actually promoting this whole idea about food banking. Go back to the column on the left where it says First Food Bank. Food banks spread to Canada in the early 1980s. The first one was established in 1981 in Edmonton in Alberta, and then they since proliferated across the country. They moved to Europe actually in 1984, and this was actually through a connection between the Edmonton Food Bank and the Paris Food Bank, and through Catholic connections, and which gave rise to the first food bank in Europe. And in 1987, in Guadalajara, the first food bank in Mexico was set up. And then they've gone global. If you look on the right-hand column under national and global spread, you can see the years when the food bank organizations in North America, well, in the States, became institutionalized, nationalized, I suppose is the right word. America's Second Harvest, which is now called Feeding America, which has a network of over 200 food banks. And you can see the years when this happened. Food banks similarly in Canada developed, and then in 1989, the Canadian Association of Food Banks was established, and which is now called Food Banks Canada in 2006, and there are 10 provincial associations. The European Federation of Food Banks actually was established sort of pretty early on in 1984 or in 1986, and now operates in 23 European countries. And the Mexican Food Bank Association was also set up in 1985. And the Global Food Banking Network and the Food Bank Leadership Institutes were set up in 2006, 2007. This is just some sort of basic information about the actual global spread. And I've looked at this in the context of the rich world, the rich industrialized world. So that's on the next slide, please. So here, what I've done, and these last two slides are actually in the book, Food Bank Nations. I've just sort of listed actually from the 60s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, the foundation of the first food bank in these countries, the National Food Bank Associations, and in OECD member states. You can see the origins up in the US in 1967, and then Canada, France, New Zealand was just interesting sort of early on. And then a whole number of countries, I put them in blue, actually were principally Catholic countries where they were initiated way back in the 80s, and following through to actually all the countries now, including Nordic Sweden. Finland also is interesting. It set up its first food banks in 1995, which of course isn't really meant to happen in the social democratic welfare state. So these countries actually have, I mean, they're not all European countries or North American countries, but they have differing kinds of welfare states. But what we really see here being institutionalized is what you might call a parallel food charity economy, which I think following sort of years of neoliberalism and sort of marketization of the economy is something that I think can well be explained in those terms. The next slide, can I have the next slide please, actually deals with their corporate capture. I thought the best way actually really of illustrating this was just to show a number well, to show the logos of some of the major big ag and big food corporations. You'll see Big Ag, Cargill is there, Conagra Foods, Monsanto, there are others as well. I didn't have space to sort of include them all, but also with some of the major big food sort of corporate transnational corporations, which operate not just in the States or North America, but actually across Europe as well and elsewhere in the world. And if you're from the UK, you'll see Walmart there. You won't see Asda, but Asda is the equivalent of Walmart in North America. I don't, when I look at some of these logos, I kind of wondering what Coca-Cola and Pepsi actually has to do with food security. But General Mills in the middle there is a very big player, and was actually behind this, the recent meeting, international summit of the Global Food Banking Network in London, which was held recently. So can I have the next slide, please? Okay, here, this again is really a repetition of the former slide, but just to show you a little bit of a breakdown between the big 10 food and beverage companies. This is the source behind the brands of Oxfam in 2013 and Forbes 2000, actually showing the major food and beverage companies which are closely associated with food banking in the global north. And then the Global Food Banking Network I've listed here from their fact sheets in 2013. The companies the transnational sort of conglomerates, big food companies who are mainly associated with them, either as sitting on their boards or as donors or supporters in different ways, or through their foundations. And you can see and sort of read the names of them there. And also in the context of Canada, the UK and the Netherlands, Unilever France and Switzerland. Interestingly, the European Federation of Food Banks also includes many of these kinds of the transnational conglomerates, food conglomerates in big ag conglomerates in its sponsors and its support: Unilever, Cargill, Bonduen, Danone, Kellogg's, Mondelez International, etc. And I would make a point here as well that the European Federation and the Global Food Banking Network work closely together, with the European Federation being the secretariat of the Global Food Banking Network. I'm not sure if that's absolutely correct today, but I know it has been in the past. And this is, under the guise of corporate social responsibility, using our surplus food, which I think is best sort of understood as edible food waste, to be provided for left behind people. And I think the essential point of what's actually happening here and what this slide shows is that something that Janet Pobendick actually in the US has pointed out numerous times, is the situation of food assistance actually replacing income assistance. And this is part of this transnational corporate food charity. And I would suggest that this is what's actually undermining the welfare state. It's undermining public policy and undermining the right to food. If we could have the next slide, please. So here, this is just, it's a little bit crowded, this particular slide, but I just posed the question, sort of widespread domestic hunger, why? Well, and four, I suppose, drivers, if you like. One has to do with financial constraints and the whole question of income poverty, which I think we've heard Sabine sort of touch on in her introduction. The risk factors, the inequality, the wealth gap. So we're looking also at unfair income distribution. These are major societal causes for the reasons why food banks have actually come into being. Then I would also say, having looked at this for over 35 years, really the lifetime, if you like, of the real bite of neoliberalism, that we're talking here about the false promises of neoliberalism, the false promises of economic growth, the failure of the mantra that work is the best and only social policy, because obviously, the labor markets have changed. We've got good jobs, bad jobs, precarious work, recessions, interrupted earnings, under unemployment, people being surplus to the labor market or being made surplus to the labor market. And when I talk about sort of food poverty or food insecurity, I really prefer to talk about domestic hunger. And I see domestic hunger being the moral vacuum at the center of neoliberalism. And this leads really into the second point, or the third point, as food banks have arisen, I would see what's been happening in society, given their public acceptance and given their public legitimacy, we've actually seen the social construction of hunger as a matter for corporate charity. Yes, there's practical compassion. Yes, there's a moral imperative to feed hungry people. This is not going to be denied, and it cannot be denied. But I think, as Andy Fisher has pointed out, in his wonderful book, sort of Big Hunger, there is an unholy alliance between US-style corporate food banking on the one hand and the anti-hunger movement on the other. This has actually arisen because of the perceived need to actually feed people. So we have here, and I think which has become increasingly a more serious driver, is the whole food waste argument, the win-win of the food-based argument. We can have leftover food and provide it for left behind people, and one at the same time, we're solving food poverty and food waste. In fact, actually, the Global Food Banking Network calls it now the green solution. But really, again, we're talking here about moving from income assistance to food assistance, secondary welfare systems, secondary food markets, and secondary food consuming. And we're depoliticizing hunger. We're taking the politics out of it. And meanwhile, we have the indifferent state, which has been ignoring human rights. And this is really a question of, I think, sort of, if you want more poverty, then just keep cutting taxes. I mean, that's actually how it works. Minimalist state, dismantled welfare states, and government silos who operate independently of each other, resulting in public policy neglect. So we could move to the next slide, please. So here, just briefly, just to talk rights talk and the right to food, and why I became interested in this, back in the 1980s when I was writing that first book, and I came across the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It was actually new to me. But I think what really we're talking about, or what I'm talking about in this context, is food is a basic human need, and it's a fundamental human right. And it's based, around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think it respects the indivisibility of all human rights. And I've listed those there. So particularly, I think in this context, the whole right of human dignity and choice. So we have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is signed by all the world's UN member states in 1966 and thereafter, and was ratified 10 years later in 76 by all countries except the US and one or two sort of minor ones, smaller countries. And this actually embodied state obligations around food, clothing, shelter, really about an adequate standard of living. It wasn't about the right to food just as itself, but the right to food, clothing and shelter, and the right to housing, but part of an adequate standard of living. And the right to food was more clearly defined by General Comment 12 by UN experts from human rights and nutrition in 1999, when every man, woman, and child alone or in community with others have physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or the means for its procurement. This really means the capacity of people being enabled to actually go into a store like anybody else and purchase the food of their choice. That's what it's about. The right to food is also a legal right. It's justiciable because a right is not a right that can be claimed, but actually it has to be constitutionalized and become actionable through the courts. This hasn't happened yet in Canada, and I think in many countries. But the right to food is not about charity. It's not about feeding the need. It's not about governments doing everything for people. It's not about giving away free food. It's not that that shouldn't happen, but that is actually not what the right to food is about. And what it's really about is we're all rights holders, but the government is the primary duty bearer. So have the next slide, please, Emily. So government is the primary duty bearer. What does that mean? The right to food obligations under international law. It means acting in compliance with them. States, when they ratify this right, this is actually what they're bound to do, and to prohibit violations. I'll be very quick. It's about respecting, protecting, and fulfilling. Some of you, I'm sure, are very knowledgeable about that particular mantra. But it means by, respect by not taking measures depriving people of their access to food, wage freezes, inadequate minimum wages, punitive welfare reforms, cutting benefits, etc., land appropriation, protecting, regulating non-state actors, the big food corporations, etc., ensuring, regulating nutrition, food safety, land rights, and fulfilling, facilitating and providing. The state must take positive actions regarding, for example, poverty reduction measures, benchmarks, indicators, etc. And it's an interesting point there in the context of the UK report of the Trussell Trust in terms of the crisis, being seen through the eyes of food bank handouts and food bank parcels. In fact, actually, these are underestimates. I mean, they're very important data, but they're underestimates. If you begin actually analyzing food insecurity, as has been done in Canada, only 1 in 4 people who are food insecure actually go to food banks. So it's about constitutional recognition. It's about creating framework laws, national policies, and the UN human rights 5-year periodic reviews. It's about holding in different governments to account. Okay, next slide, please, Emily. So this is really my last slide, and what I've talked about in the book is about civil society with a right to food bite. I think the subtext of the right to food is really accountability, it's really public policy, and it's really mobilization. I mean, human rights really aren't very powerful unless they're mobilized, and they have to be continually mobilized. And I think in terms of public policy, it means joined up public policy, connecting the policy dots. Income security, adequate basic income, food policy, public health, social policy, etc. But it also means joined up civil society. And I think that means civil society in our different sort of silos as well coming together. And one of the ways for doing that is through monitoring of public accountability and looking at and activating the UN 5-year periodic reviews and changing the conversation from charity to the right to food. And there are a couple of examples there. Freedom 90 in Ontario, which was set up years ago by volunteers in the food banks who become volunteers when they retired, in their 50s and 60s. And actually they wanted to become free of this obligation by the time they sort of reached the age of 90. That still hasn't happened. And then you've got, the IFAN, WhyHunger, GN, RTFN, Nourish Scotland. And Nourish Scotland is where I sort of look at the moment, the menu for change, where they're talking about in Scotland, which has really taken up this issue, cash, rights, food. And I just end with a little quote from Louise Arbour, who was the former Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada and a former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She says, "There will always be a place for charity, but charitable responses are not an effective, principled, or sustainable substitute for enforceable human rights guarantees." So many thanks, Emily, for moving the slides ahead, and many thanks to everyone for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Graham. And if anyone has any questions, please remember you can ask them at any time, and we'll keep a lookout for them, and we'll be asking them in due course. Now we'll hear from Imogen Richmond Bishop, who's the Right to Food Project Coordinator for Sustain, as well as the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Just Fair.
Hi. So Sustain advocates for food and agricultural policies and practices that enhance the health and welfare of people and animals, improve the working and living environment, enrich society and culture, and promote equity. We represent 100 public interest organisations working at international, national, regional, and local level. Our work on food poverty includes a collaborative project with Church Action on Poverty, where we coordinate the lottery-funded Food Power programme. This programme works with food poverty alliances to tackle food poverty through people-powered change. This can be through involving experts by experience in strategic alliance work, promoting a joined-up approach, and facilitating learning and sharing good practice amongst peers. Every year, our London Food Poverty campaign publishes a league table of London boroughs which shows what each borough is doing to tackle food poverty in its area. This report is supported by the Mayor of London and covers 10 measures, policies or actions that are within the control and influence of the Council. And finally, the Right to Food Project, which is a project that I coordinate. Working closely with civil society and academics, we are looking at how to create the domestic legal framework to bring home the commitments successive UK governments have made to uphold our human right to adequate food and to a fair and sustainable food system. We have a, next slide, please. Sorry. Oh, can you go back one? Thanks. We have identified 4 key issues with the food system in the UK. The first one is food poverty, which I'll touch on a bit more later, but at its most basic definition means that someone struggles to put food on the table, or that they have to reduce the quantity or the quality of the food that they have, predominantly due to a lack of money. The UN has estimated that there are 8.4 million people who are food insecure in the UK, out of a total population of an estimated 60 million. The second one is food access. Many people, especially those in low-income areas, live in areas classified as food swamps or food deserts. This means that their access to fresh, affordable food is limited, and they are often forced to pay a poverty premium, meaning that their purchases are more expensive than equivalent purchases in an area with wider food choices. In order to tackle the lack of choice and the poverty premium, food access needs to be properly considered in town planning decisions. This consideration may take the form of increasing provision of healthy food retail or markets, providing affordable public transportation, or Meals on Wheels provision. Sadly, what we've seen over recent years is that the latter two have been cut by many local councils in the UK, who've been forced to reduce costs. The third one is food quality. So whilst there are regulatory bodies in place that are intended to guarantee that the food within our system is safe from contaminants, many people on low incomes or are suffering from food insecurity complain about the low quality of cheap food. 15-year-old Corey from the Darwin Gets Hungry campaign told my Food Power colleague what it was like for her and her family during the 5-week waiting period before her mother was switched to Universal Credit, which is the main welfare system in the UK. She said, "It were hard. It were really hard. We had to sometimes go without the biggest meals, or we had to have horrible food, cheap, rubbish food. This point about cheap rubbish food is particularly relevant as there is a co-location of obesity and poverty. In order to follow the government's Eat Well guidelines, 1 in 5 families would have to spend 40% of their income after housing costs, which is simply not feasible. So the last one is food production. As I've mentioned, many people are unable to afford enough food, and especially enough fresh food like fruits and vegetables. This does not mean that we should reduce the cost of food, but rather we need to increase its affordability and accessibility. Farmers currently only receive 8% of the final cost of food, and many farm workers do not enjoy the paid holiday, sick pay, pension contributions, and other benefits that workers in many industries take for granted. Sustained research has found that a low-paid workforce has a negative impact on the rural economy, making communities poorer and more vulnerable to decline. The fact that some of those who grow and sell our food are going hungry is shocking, but can be prevented. Behaviour and pricing in the food supply chain needs to be regulated to ensure fair incomes to suppliers, including farmers and growers. People working in food retail are also particularly vulnerable to poverty, with many staff working in some of the major UK supermarkets having to resort to using food banks due to low pay. The highest recipients of working tax credits in the UK are those in the retail sector, of which 37% work in food retail. Put in another way, this means that the taxpayer is effectively subsidising companies who don't pay their staff enough money so that they can cover their basic living costs. Next slide, please. So what do we know about food poverty in the UK? On the one hand, we know a lot. We have data from emergency food aid providers, we have data from advice services, and if we listen, then we also have testimonials from people with direct lived experience themselves. Then on the other hand, we don't know enough. The government has only just agreed to start measuring household food insecurity on an annual scale, and far too often, people who have a direct lived experience of food poverty are not invited to the table when decisions are made about policies that will affect them. This is not just decision making within government, but also within civil society as well. From the information that we do have, we can gather an idea of who is most affected by food poverty. For example, 3% of food bank users are asylum seekers, which is disproportionately high given that only 0.1% of households in the UK apply to seek asylum. Last year's figures from Scotland, where they do measure household food insecurity, showed that 21% of single parents experience food insecurity, compared with 8% of the general population. A recent Equalities and Human Rights Commission cumulative impact assessment of recent tax and welfare reform found that lone parents, of whom 90% are women, lost on average 1/5 of their income. This explains quite clearly why this group of people is most at risk of food poverty. So what causes food poverty? Well, lots of things, but it's not an actual lack of food in the UK. The shelves in our supermarkets are full to bursting, and a lot of this food ends up getting thrown away. Food poverty is mainly caused by systematic issues linked to austerity measures, such as the benefit freeze, the 2-child limit, and the built-in waiting time before receiving a welfare payment. In February of this year, the Department of Work and Pensions Secretary herself admitted that this delay in welfare payments was a key causal factor in the rise of food bank use. The government here, rather than protecting its citizens from destitution, is now pushing people into poverty. There have also been a series of decisions made that have disproportionately benefited those on high incomes, despite cutbacks on provisions for those on low incomes. For example, the changes to the personal tax allowance has meant that the top 10% get an extra £6,500 a year, and the bottom 10% will only get £600. In order to respond to the growing numbers of people in our communities that are suffering from food poverty, many people across the country have set up emergency food aid services. These range from initiatives like the Real Junk Food Project that intercepts food surplus and redistributes it to the community on a pay-as-you-feel basis, food banks that can distribute tens of thousands of parcels a year, and this number is ever growing, or lunch clubs like those run by Food Cycle that can help tackle both isolation and hunger. If you added it all up, people across the country are spending hundreds of thousands of hours working on these projects, and many more are spending hundreds of thousands of pounds in donations. Whilst this outpouring of solidarity, community spirit is extremely commendable, and I'm sure many of the people speaking on this webinar or listening in have spent time working on such projects, it's not sustainable, and unfortunately these projects cannot solve food poverty alone and only help mitigate some of the problems. There is also a real danger that's been flagged by a number of academics that food charity may be unwittingly be playing a role in depoliticising food and poverty. As I've said, at its root, food poverty is not really about food, but it's about low incomes, spiralling living costs, and stagnant welfare payments. If we really want to tackle food poverty, we need to tackle these issues in a systemic and sustainable way. Next slide, please. So we all have a right to food. Successive UK governments have taken this commitment on an international stage through signing and ratifying conventions, declarations, covenants, and more. Unfortunately, as many people in the UK know, having a right is just not the same as enjoying a right. We believe that in order for all of us to enjoy this right, it needs to be enshrined into domestic legislation, like a number of civil and political rights are. There are lots of examples from around the world of how this can be done, and in fact right now the Scottish Parliament is looking into how to incorporate the right to food into domestic law through its Good Food Nation bill. The right to food, as my colleague mentioned before, is not just about having food and having enough money to put food on the table, but it also includes a vision for a fair and sustainable food system for all. Food within the system needs to be accessible, both financially and geographically, adequate so that it meets nutritional requirements and is culturally appropriate. And finally, this food has to be available, so this can be through access to land and sustainability of the food system for future generations. And this is a question I get asked a lot, is what is the point of thinking about food poverty and human rights together? Well, when we see food as a human right, this can change how we actually view hunger. Human rights places obligations on a state to guarantee that rights are upheld. This means that a state has to provide the conditions whereby its citizens are able to eat well and must offer assistance when they're unable to do so unaided. This requires integrating the right throughout decision making and provides scope for challenge and remedies when the right is breached. To conclude, at the end of the day, food poverty doesn't happen in isolation from other aspects of poverty, and in order to address the former, we need to tackle the latter. We urgently need our government to ensure that people have enough money in their wallets to put food on the table. This can either be through jobs that pay a fair wage or through a welfare safety net that supports people when they're in need. At Sustain, we know that there are a number of steps that can be taken to ensure that our food system works for all of us, and we're looking forward to seeing these steps being taken. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imogen. And now we'll hear from Alison Cohen, who's Senior Director of Programs at WhyHunger, who'll be speaking to us from North Carolina.
Hi, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all so much for being a part of this webinar. We're looking forward to the next two that will follow it. I am Alison Cohen. I work with an organization called WhyHunger. I happen to be in North Carolina today, but we are based out of New York City as an organization. And we are a grassroots support organization providing support to frontline organizations and social movements, both globally and domestically, that are working to secure the right to food and food sovereignty. What I've been challenged with or tasked with today is to give you a little bit of a analysis of the context around food insecurity in the United States, frankly, in a country that has not signed on to or ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Next slide, please. In 2017, just to give you some of the facts, an estimated 1 in 8 Americans were food insecure. This is equates to about 41 million Americans, including more than 12 million children. These stats are based on the U.S. Department of Agriculture's definition of food insecurity as a lack of consistent access to enough food for an active, healthy life. Next slide. Critical to note is that the prevalence of food security in the U.S. has not varied much over the past couple of decades. It has hovered around 12% and is yet to go back to pre-recession levels. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the sort of face of hunger in our country. Food insecurity is stratified across racial lines. It affects less than 9% of white households in America, but nearly 22% of Black households and 18% of Latinx households, higher than the national average of around 12%. Mariana Chilton writes, "You cannot take on poverty and hunger without taking on historical and contemporary discrimination." Despite civil rights gains in our country, the legacy of a nation whose origins include the removal of indigenous people and the labor of enslaved Africans persists today in the form of institutionalized and systemic racism. The stratification of hunger across racial lines coexists with the wealth gap between whites and people of color. The average wealth of white families is 7 times higher than that of Black families. Systemic racism reinforces this wealth gap between people of color and whites, and the hunger gap as well. People of color in the US still do not have equal access to sufficient wages, reliable jobs, and have fewer assets than white folks. Next slide, please. So how do people who are food insecure in the United States get access to food? There are 2 prominent ways this happens today. One mechanism is through the state in the form of SNAP, which is also known as food stamps, through school lunch and other publicly funded social benefits programs. The other is private charity through food banks, food pantries, and soup kitchens. So we do have a social safety net in the United States, though it's fraying at the seams and it is consistently embattled. Still, government nutrition assistance helps some 40 million people in the United States, and at least 12% of Americans, as we've said, are food insecure, and 4 out of 5 people experience poverty at some point in their lifetime. So what was initially seen as a food emergency in the 1970s is now a chronic problem of hunger. Since the 1970s, we've seen an erosion of the social safety net. These are many of the themes that we heard Graham speak about as well. An erosion of the social safety net, an increase in precarious employment, underemployment, part-time employment, wages that don't keep pace with inflation, and an end to what used to be strong bipartisan support for effective government nutrition supports. In addition, we've seen a dramatic rise in economic inequality. And that's when and why the private nonprofit charitable food sector has grown to become a secondary distribution system. And over the decades, emergency food providers have become more professionalized with sophisticated warehousing and supply chain management, large warehouses, unwavering community support, vast numbers of volunteers, and because the need is there, they distribute more and more food each year. But this can also be a bit misleading because the vast majority of support for food insecure people in the US still comes from the government and not private charity. 1 in 12 bags of food assistance comes from private charities. The rest comes from federal programs. And while food banks, food pantries, and other food access organizations do admirable and very necessary work with few resources, their contribution amounts to roughly 4% of the charitable response to hunger in the United States. Government nutrition programs provide the rest. Next slide. In the early 1980s, after a large recession where manufacturing jobs were lost and the Reagan administration slashed federal benefits such as food stamps, we began to really embark on a charity approach as a more serious attempt to address what was considered to be an emergency at the time, which is why it was called the emergency food system. And welfare reform under the Clinton administration continued to reinforce the need for charity because it lifted the government's role in providing for basic income for the most impoverished people in our country. The emergency in the late 1970s, however, has never gone away, and the state's role in providing a social safety net remains embattled. Meanwhile, food insecurity still hovers around 12% and has so consistently since. Next slide. Food charity has become institutionalized. Nearly 5 billion pounds of food a year gets distributed through food banks. And there are more than 200 food banks, as Graham mentioned previously, in the Feeding America network. And we know, though we're not 100% sure, we know that there are conservative estimates say around 60,000 different food access organizations or emergency food providers. That includes food banks, food pantries, and food access providers in the US. They all have some variation of an organizational mission to end hunger in their communities. The primary strategy of the private charitable nonprofit food banking system is to capture surplus food and redistribute it, as this graphic demonstrates. Secondarily, and what many food pantries prefer, frankly, is to solicit funds to purchase food. Next slide. A recent trend, excuse me, a recent trend in messaging among food banks, especially food banking networks such as Feeding America and the Global Food Banking Network, is to emphasize their role in eliminating food waste as a means of not only feeding hungry people, but simultaneously doing right by the planet by keeping food waste out of landfills. And food waste is real. It's a real problem. Approximately 72 billion pounds of edible food from every point in the food production cycle ends up in landfills and incinerators every year. And yet everyone is seemingly jumping on this narrative bandwagon. The food industry, environmental organizations, government agencies, and even the UN all agree that reducing food waste has to be a top priority for protecting the environment. The UN even set a very ambitious goal of reducing food waste by half in the year 2030, and both the US Environmental Protection Agency and the US Department of Agriculture have now publicly said they're working to meet that goal. The problem lies in the narrative that the charitable food sector is spinning. Rescuing this perfectly, and this is a quote from Feeding America's website, rescuing this perfectly edible whole food means feeding families facing hunger and taking a large step in protecting our planet and conserving our resources. This narrative redirects the issue from poverty to environmentalism with a hefty dose of implied moral imperative, skipping right over the issue of reducing the volume of surplus food generated in the first place. And as a nation, we do seem to have the tendency to avoid some of these sticky political questions in favor of technological solutions. And by doing so, we're ignoring economic systems, policies, and other incentives that perpetuate them. Next slide. Andy Fisher, who Graham also referenced in his presentation, argues in his book, Big Hunger, that the corporate food industry has a stake in perpetuating the charitable food system. For instance, when the unpurchased baked goods pass their sell-by date, retailers earn a tax deduction for donating them to charities at the generous bid point between retail and wholesale price, allowing them to recapture part of their overhead. In addition, charitable donations can help retailers reduce their garbage disposal costs as well as improve their public image. And this is just a small example of the benefits accrued to the food industry for dispensing with surplus food. Andy's research suggests that efforts to end hunger, reduce diet-related health problems, and reform farm subsidies are compromised by corporate interests. And he calls to task food banks and anti-hunger organizations for becoming, in many ways, a dependent of the food industry. Next slide. And yet, food banks and food pantries and soup kitchens are beginning to shift their practices and strategies. Many food banks around the country have dramatically increased the amount of fruits and veggies they distribute. A smaller number are refusing to accept junk food. Others are engaged in advocacy for an increase in public benefits or other public policies that address hunger at its root causes, including living wage campaigns and housing rights. And you'll hear much more about these strategies and really some remarkable work that folks are doing in this sector during the next webinar. And yet, nearly half a century after the first food bank opened its doors, the US has failed to solve its hunger problem, while the food banking model proliferates in the US and is exported to countries around the world. By simply defining the problem as hunger, the approaches to ameliorate it excuse me, have been largely limited to access, capturing and distributing corporate food waste, and protecting government nutrition assistance programs. Charitable food distribution has become normalized. How do we disrupt this state of affairs? Next slide. The public perception that the problem of hunger can be solved with charity and food access alone further absolves the government of responsibility and ignores the role of other systemic root causes of hunger, such as low wages and underemployment, corporate control of farming and labor, effectively displacing farmers from the land, and the legacy of racial oppression. Today, emergency food providers continue to distribute food, and many acknowledge that equity and justice are critical to end hunger. But how are we making that shift? And what is the role of a rights-based framework in making that happen? Next slide. Despite the role of the US in contributing ideas and language to the UN Declaration on Human Rights, we have famously declined to ratify the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which recognizes the right to food. And we've done this citing existing protections in federal laws. This seems to sort of serve to maintain the myth that capitalism, or the dominant capitalist economic paradigm, will create opportunities for everyone to pull themselves up and out of poverty. And yet countries endorsing the right to adequate food and nutrition and taking steps to operationalize it, for instance, Brazil, France, all Scandinavian countries, Eastern European countries, Japan, have much lower prevalence of moderate and severe food insecurity than the US, even when their GDP is much lower than ours. Charitable programs combined with entitlement programs cannot accomplish the goals of ending hunger and food insecurity. They do not address the root causes such as racism, falling real wages, and rising inequality, all stemming from reliance on an extractive economic model. They do not critique the entrenched institutions, policies, and practices that privilege profits over people. They do not incorporate the communities at the front lines of hunger and food insecurity in their design and implementation, nor do they respond to this chronic predicament by building robust, diversified, sustainable, and decentralized food economies. The right to adequate food and nutrition is both a call to action and a global legal framework for coordinated reform in food and agriculture. But how do we use the right to food framework in a country that has not ratified the right to food? Next slide. WhyHunger envisions expanding the right to food as an organizing tool and framework as a means to contribute to developing a common analysis and agenda among sectors that are currently working in silos. At the same time, disseminating and nourishing the conversations around the right to food and food sovereignty will bring US organizations into the debates and processes happening at the global level. We can use the right to food as a narrative change tool and as a tool for building power to hold the state accountable for addressing hunger at its root causes. A rights-based organizing strategy will help the anti-hunger sector to join together with other movements and campaigns. Next slide, please. Living wage campaigns, farmer workers, food justice workers, anti-racism. Anti-hunger organizations are getting better at advocacy, especially beyond the bounds of SNAP and TFAP. However, we still have a long way to go to join vociferously with other movements and campaigns for the long haul. One strategy that we have begun to work on in the US is forming a network called Closing the Hunger Gap. And in this network, which you'll hear more about in the next webinar as well, we are working to build power and break down isolation by building a national alliance in order to change institutions from the inside out. And these institutions are food access organizations that are coming together. And it's not just a network of organizations, but one whose structure is putting the community-based frontline organizations and their clients and patrons at the center of determining the core strategies of the alliance. We're talking about things like, how do we influence our boards of directors? How do we divest from corporate funders who are contributing to the problems that we're trying to solve? We're 150 members and growing. Our 4th conference is coming up, and we are addressing issues at these conferences that have been somewhat taboo. In other words, not what food banks do. We're flipping the switch on who has decision-making power. And we invite you to join us at our 4th conference in Raleigh, North Carolina in September of this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alison. And now I think we'll have some questions and answers, and maybe, Emily, we could see everybody that's taking part, the participants. Thank you.
Yeah, I think everyone has to turn on their own webcam. I'm realizing I didn't have as much power as
Okay, here we are. Emily, do you have some questions that you might want to put out there?
Not yet, but maybe just to remind everybody that if you have any questions, you can use either the chat function or the question function as well that you used before, if you have any questions for the speakers.
Okay. So Graham and Imogen, do you want to turn on your cameras maybe so we can see you? But in the meantime, Alison, I wanted to ask you a question, if that was okay. Just to get an idea, you know, how can we start to work together as a global movement? What do you think we should be prioritizing? Should we be prioritizing explaining what the right to food actually is? Should we be prioritizing making sure that everybody understands how big the crisis is? I mean, what are the first steps that we should be taking in terms of establishing a right to food, the right to food within legal frameworks worldwide?
Oh, 1 second. There you go, Alison.
Okay, thanks. I forgot that I had to unmute myself. Yeah, so I think that it's certainly a tall order, and it's something, and we need to be doing all of those things at the same time, probably, Sabine. And I do think that bringing the right to food in as both an organizing and a narrative change tool is a critical piece of this work. And in particular for the United States to do a deep dive and really understand the utility of the right to food and what it means in terms of being a coordinated, providing a platform for a coordinated analysis and strategic approach. We need to build desperately, I think, with our colleagues around the world that are and have built some very effective social movements for food sovereignty and for the right to food. We have a lot to learn from them, and we are not going to make progress, I think, since this is a global issue. It's being the problems are being rapidly exported around the world, and unless we do this together across the globe, we won't make the kind of wholesale transformation that we're looking to make.
And Imogen, sorry, and I just want thinking about the fact that we have even trouble just trying to explain what the right to food means, and there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what it means. Does it mean, you know, you can get access to a food bank, or does it, you know, what does it actually mean? So how can we explain that better? How can we reach a wider audience as to what the right to food actually means? You need to put your mic on, Imogen.
Hi, I've just been unmuted. Yeah, well, I think what's quite interesting is if you actually listen to people who have a direct lived experience of food poverty, they generally in conversation seem to have a much better grasp of what the right to food is, and are calling for it and seem to have an understanding of it. I know, say, for example, today the Children's Future Food Inquiry came out in the UK, and one of the key things that the children were calling for who were involved in the inquiry was that their right to food be upheld. So they obviously see value and see power in the right to food as a concept and as an idea. So I think really by engaging with people with direct lived experience and sort of seeing what they see as solutions to food poverty, which won't be emergency food aid, it'll be more structural things like, for example, protections in the rental market. That's one major issue that we're facing in the UK, which doesn't have anything to do with food, but if your rent goes up and your wages are stagnating, then you won't be able to afford to put enough food on the table. So yeah, so I would suggest that. And I think, yeah, I've had a few people when I've mentioned that, you know, I work on the right to food, they've said, oh, well, do you mean a food bank on every corner? And actually, I don't mean that. I mean that people are able to access, are able to afford food that's not only nutritious and it, you know, they're able to access it in a dignified manner, which means they have choice, that they, you know, they can go into any shop that they choose and be able to get what they need.
And could I just jump in for 1 second and add to what Imogen said? about the right to food is that I think it's really, and this also builds on what Graham was saying about a joined up civil society. So really understanding that the right to food is intersectional, that it is part and parcel with the right to housing, the right to water, the right to access land for food production. And I think that one area in which we have perhaps not one of the areas in which we could very quickly, I think, begin to coordinate, and that many of us are working on, that we haven't seen a lot of movement on yet, is coordinating between the food and farming, the farming sector and the food sector, right? So those of us that are working in the anti-hunger world often are not cognizant of or engaged in advocating for or learning about how to work with small farmers and those practicing agroecology. And so I think that it is critical that we begin bringing those two sectors together. And I think the right to food has the potential to do that.
Did you want to add anything, Graham?
Did you hear me? Oh, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yep, okay. Well, I would agree with what Alison has just said about, I suppose, working with the food movement, because I think there's a tension between sort of right to food advocates who look at the international covenant and actually, the Convention on the Right to the Child. I mean, there are a whole range of covenants there that actually are inclusive of the right to food. But I think that there's a tension between these arguments and between people in the food movement, particularly around sort of the ideas of food sovereignty, that there really needs to be some shared conversations about what's going on. I mean, I come from a social policy background, and I have to say that I don't really feel myself sort of particularly knowledgeable about the food area. But by the same token, I think people in the food poverty, in the food movement, aren't particularly knowledgeable about social policy and actually issues of social justice and income justice and inequality. Because I think otherwise we get into a sort of a standoff. What I think, it's been referred to, I think Alison referred to it, this is a standoff between sort of environmental causes on the one hand and inequality causes on the other hand, when actually they're very much related. I mean, climate change is here, it's coming at us, it's threatening all around. And I think, if you wanted to start thinking about a role for food banks, I mean, I would think food banks actually should be making sure that when natural disasters and man-made disasters are coming, that we actually have enough food. Because I think I said once before, when I was watching the hurricane actually in Carolina not long ago, there was a little chart that came up on the television screen which said the food banks are running out of food. Well, actually, food banks always run out of food, okay? So if they're running out of food for people who are living daily lives or trying to live precarious lives, they're running out of food there. What about when these imminent disasters come? Because I think that's actually probably a role where I might actually be able to get my head around corporate food banking. But anyway.
Good point. Good point. Emily, do you have any questions?
I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
I'm trying to find, there's so many different questions, and some are quite specific and some are maybe more overarching. So I just maybe grouped a couple together to start with, and we can see where we get. I think there's two that I think are maybe interesting for the speakers here. We can see how we want to deal with them. The first is what country does food justice work in a good way? Like, what are some good examples of things that are places where things are working well? So maybe that's a question where we see how we answer that. And then the other is what kind of work is being done to address issues of intersectionalities? Specifically, it was mentioned in the UK, but maybe also more broadly. Also, someone also addressed sort of in the line we now see of more authoritarian governments or right-leaning governments and how that shift has had an impact on this work. So maybe we start with those, and then I can keep collecting.
Well, maybe in the context of the first question, where food justice may be working well, I mean, I would suggest that maybe if you look at, you know, the social democratic sort of Nordic welfare states, I think that's where you probably will see food justice working better. I mean, they're much more the late arrivals actually on the food bank scene. And I think sort of historically, their welfare states have ensured that people's benefits are adequate, that incomes are adequate. I mean, these are countries as well where the price of food is high, but they pay high wages, and you know they actually have a social contract which really works. Of course, it gets threatened, but I think over time you would look there. The other country that I would look at historically has been Brazil, you know, before, you know, recent years, because I think under Lula and the developments there with the right to food, you know, Emily will know this. I mean, you know, it's been picked up in terms of FIAN, and has really been put to work. Actually, food banks played a part in that. But I think it really was a very dedicated policy of making sure through certain sort of conditional programs, you know, if children were going to school, then, you know, food or income would be provided. There were a whole range of policies there where I think food justice historically now, I think because, you know, things have changed, where you could see it at work. Maybe also in the early days of welfare states, you know, as well, when people had memories of World War II and they wanted to create a better society. And I think that, you know, the structures which came along, which were developed at that time in the early sort of post-World War II era, were beneficial. It's also interesting to note that during World War II, when one thinks of the UK, one thinks of food rationing. I mean, food rationing was introduced, you know, because of the threat to, you know, food security in the UK. But at that time and over that time, I think what the studies show is that actually the health of the nation improved. So maybe, you know, if you want to sort of think about this in terms of what to do, I mean, maybe you could put rationing up there in terms of government regulation. I mean, I think given that food is a public good and should be shared, you know, but maybe we don't want to go there. But on the other hand, I think there are all kinds of sort of interesting things, I think, historically about where food justice has worked.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that 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 I'm not sure that we can say as a whole that there's, other than the Scandinavian, some of the Northern European countries and others that are still strong welfare states, that there is a nation state that is that has gotten it right in terms of food justice. But I know we can look at various communities, we can look at various parts. I think in the United States in particular, that given the way the government operates, that we have some opportunities in citywide opportunities, you know, municipally as well as statewide, where there are some opportunities to where we're beginning to see that the state has a higher food security than, say, a neighboring state because of policies and things that they're putting into place. So we have examples of that. I don't. And I think it's important, and I'm excited about the next webinar because I know that will be an opportunity to really lift up some of those examples of ways in which communities and various you know, cities and states are beginning to resist the increasing food insecurity that we see coming alongside the right-leaning governments.
Mm-hmm.
Imogen, did you want to add anything further?
I think Graham and Alison have both touched on food justice working well. I think, yeah, like they both said is there are good examples from countries and there are bad examples from other countries. I guess to touch on the intersectionality question, I mean, that's something that we look at a lot, as there's a definite correlation between, for example, being a woman that puts you at a higher risk of food insecurity in some instances. If you look at who's been most affected by recent tax and welfare reform in the UK, it has been people with disabilities, it has been lone parents, or it has been Black minority ethnic people. As I said earlier in the figures, for example, food bank use by asylum seekers is 3% of all food bank parcels given out are given to that group, whereas they only represent 0.1% of households. So there's obviously particular reasons why certain groups are more affected than others. Along with colleagues from Coventry University and Migrants' Rights Group, we're working on looking at people with no recourse to public funds, and that's an immigration status, where people are not eligible to receive any assistance from the government. And this means that they're at particular risk of food insecurity because they're not able to claim whatever welfare entitlements other people are allowed to get. And this predominantly affects people who are Black minority ethnic. And I think it's something that we really need to look at as a group, how different populations are more affected or less affected by food poverty. And then I think to touch on the austerity point, I know I mentioned this in my talk, but there has been a number of measures that have been introduced over the past 10 years that have directly led to an increase of food poverty in the UK. Things like, for example, having to wait 5 weeks before the payment of universal credit, which is the main welfare system in the UK. Having the freeze, we've had a freeze for the past 3 years on benefits, but obviously prices of everything else have risen. So this just means that all of these different elements have just led to families struggling more and more and more. And I think there's a number of stats. I know the New Economics Foundation, for example, have done some work on this, on just how much austerity has actually cost the economy as a whole, that I think is quite often ignored. So, yeah.
Could I just say something, go back to an earlier point that was being talked about around the right to food, in terms of how one engages this more global narrative about, in terms of sort of bringing people together around this issue. I think it is very important that people are clear about what the right to food means and what it doesn't mean, because I think if not, it becomes very confusing. And I'm waiting for maybe the Global Food Banking Network to say that it's talking about the right to food, you see? Because I think those are, I mean, I can just sort of think back and think about terms like community development. There are a whole range of terms which actually have been hijacked actually by sort of corporate interests. And I think there comes a point where it becomes meaningless. And the right to food, if it's just used in a rhetorical sense, I think in one sense it's important, but in another sense, you've got to know what the fundamentals are about it, you know, that it is about enabling people to be able to feed themselves and their children. It is about enabling, you know, sufficient food to be available, etc. And it's not, as Andy, I think, sort of talked to, it's not about feeding the need. It's not that that shouldn't happen, maybe it has to happen at certain points, but that's not what it is. So I think we have to be very clear about what it is and what it isn't. And I think that's what General Comment 12 set out to do when they tried to clarify the meaning of it, because I think it had got lost in these international covenants. So that to me, I think, is a very critical point. And there needs to be, I think, a sort of measure of agreement. I'm sounding very essentialist about it, but I think there are some core points here that actually should, I think, in my view, drive the debate.
And I would, yeah, I would in part agree with you, Graham, that you know, we definitely see it we see similar phrases or phrases that sort of evoke the right to food used by food banks all across the country. That's, you know, say things like everybody deserves a healthy meal, or, you know, they have taglines that are very that really evoke a rights-based language. And so yes, there's the need to understand that, understand exactly what that means, and also the contradictory message that you know, in saying that everyone deserves a right to food, but only through through private charity, right? So that's a big contradiction that we have to deal with, and it's an opportunity. I think that's the way that we're thinking about it, is that that there are these organizations that have a large constituency of folks, both that are coming to them for food, but also in many cases a larger number of folks that are volunteers that are at these that come to support these food banks, and in that there is an opportunity to really explore what to do some political education and to raise consciousness around what is it that you mean when you say everyone deserves a right to a healthy meal as your tagline. So
yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I agree as well. I mean, we've talked. I mean, people who experience this, I think their voice is actually critically important. I think at the same time, the volunteers in the food bank organization, I think their voice is critically important. I mean, they're the unpaid labor in all of this. I mean, and I think, you know, it's been referred to in terms of how many hours of work is actually being put in, because I think I think as time has gone on, I think people are becoming more aware, and I think this whole this narrative that we're talking about is one that should be explored with them and interpreted, because I think that's where the energy will come from to bring about the kind of changes that are needed.
Emily, have we got time for another question? Or
well, I think we have about 5 minutes, and there's so many questions.
yeah.
Maybe just to say that we will all take note of these of the questions that are coming up, because I think actually in the series of webinars, I think that some of them will be tackled in a better way even than in this space. For example, just to say that there's a lot of questions around issues of representation within not only intersectionality in terms of analysis, but also representation within the actual governance structures of organizations in food banks, and I think that will be for sure in the next webinar. And there's a lot of questions around different kinds of models that can be used and what kind of criticisms are around them. And again, I think that those people who are really in the actual work around in the food banks will probably be best positioned to answer those questions. And I think so maybe it's also an encouragement to join the next webinar. Maybe rather it would make more sense to, if anybody had one last thing to add.
Touching quickly on the point about involving people with direct lived experience of issues, which I think is something that we can definitely recognise is a lot of people in civil society or academics aren't doing enough to involve those people. And I know, so for example, with the UK government, they're reporting this year on the SDGs, and one of the things where they've really fallen flat is involving people's direct lived experience of issues, for example, housing, food, whatever it may be. And it's just something that, unfortunately, a lot of the meetings that happen that discuss these issues, especially decision-making meetings, happen behind closed doors, happen in London, happen in places which are not accessible to everyone. And I know a lot of people with direct lived experience do not feel heard, do not feel listened to, do not feel like they are engaged with in the decision-making process. And I think that's something that we can all work on and push our governments to work on more. I know last year the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, on extreme poverty and human rights visited the UK. And whilst he was going around the whole country, one of the things that, because I was involved in a few events with him, one of the things that participants said at these testimonial gathering events was that they actually felt listened to. And it was one of the first times that, you know, a decision maker, someone of influence, someone of importance came and saw them. You know, you don't necessarily see Amber Rudd, who's the Department of Work and Pension Secretary, going out and listening to people in the field in a way that he was doing, and actually, you know, being very respectful and engaging. And I think that's something that we can definitely all learn from. So yeah.
Did you have a final thought, Graham?
I think in terms of moving forward, in terms of understanding what these, what the right to food is about, I think there's a key role to be played by journalists. And I think one of the things that I came across when I was writing the Food Bank Nations was that, particularly in the States, I'm not sure whether this is correct, but what I learned was that there's no longer in the media what they call a poverty beat. There's no longer a journalist whose special responsibility it is to actually to report on the kinds of issues that we're talking about, and that this is kind of gone out of style, or it's no longer used. And so when you have journalists actually reporting it, with the exceptions of people like Patrick Butler and some of them, The Guardian, and maybe there are others as well that I'm not aware of, you get really a problem in terms of how our story is actually being told and how we would like it to be heard. It's not telling journalists what to do, but it's actually about journalists actually having understood the issue over a period of time and actually being able to write critically and thoughtfully about it. So that's just one thing I would put on the table about how, if we want to develop a global voice, I think we need some global people, journalists actually reporting on these matters. Yeah.
Alison?
I'll just very briefly add on to what Graham was saying, that yes, I think he's correct. I agree with him. I don't know about whether or not we have lost our journalists who focus on a particular beat around poverty or hunger. There's definitely some reporting that happens around that. And I would say that we're all communicators, and we communicate with, through the various media that our organizations have. There's a whole variety of different ways in which we can begin to shift the narrative. And so I think that's a key piece. I think it is really, really key that we begin to debunk some of the myths around the need for charity as consistently and as broadly and as and in such a large reach that we have over the last few decades. And so to really begin thinking through what are the other narrative opportunities, what are the other tools, what are the other points of disruption that we can identify and bring this message about the true solutions to ending hunger to folks, to the public.
Emily, do you want to say a bit something about the next two webinars?
Yeah, sure. I think I put it in the slide, and also you can find it in the chat, the link for the next one. But as we shared in the invitation, this was designed as a series of webinars to try to cover different aspects of this issue. Today was more sort of the overarching analysis around sort of the problematic nature of food banks and the charity model as a solution to hunger, especially in the context of the global north. I'm exposing a bit more about what the right to food issues are. And the next webinar will be focused really on hearing from the people who are really engaged in food banks, and people who are how can we say, emergency feeding strategies and different alternatives, and people who are really on the ground working on this. So you can find the link to the webinar there in the chat, and we will send it around to everybody afterwards, along with the link to the third webinar, which will be more really from hearing from the voices of the people who are suffering and really facing poverty, and trying to really hear more from the lived experience, and starting to discuss a bit more around solutions and different strategies as well. And just to say maybe also that we will, there's a lot of questions about this, we will for sure be sending all of the materials to everybody in the recorded webinar so you can share with your colleagues who weren't here. And if you want to watch again because it was so great. So you will receive
and we'll try to address all the questions that have come up, you know, either through in the next 2 webinars, or, you know, we'll try to get back to folks about those questions.
Yeah, I would like to thank you all for organising this. I could be a little bit emotional about it, but I've kind of waited 35 years to have such a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very, very much for joining us. And thank you, Emily. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Imogen.
Thank you.
I leave it to Emily to sign off finally.
Yes, I guess. Thanks to everyone again. We really appreciate how many people, we had over almost 200 people sign up, so it's a really huge indicator that this is a topic we need to talk more about. And we don't have to wait 35 more years, as Graham said.
Great.
We hope to continue this in the next couple of weeks with the next webinar, and we will make sure that there's a lot of options for people to really opt in for more information and to really join this bigger effort. So thanks a lot, and we will hope to see you again in a couple of weeks.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, bye-bye. How does this all work?